The darkness of absolute power. From the outside, the throne of Egypt gleamed brighter than the sun. Draped in gold, guarded by legions, praised by priests, the Pharaoh appeared untouchable, a god among men, ruling with divine right over all the lands touched by the Nile. His face adorned temples, his name echoed in prayers, and his commands carved into stone. But behind this brilliant mask lay something far more human and far more dangerous. Absolute power does not illuminate. It casts a long and inescapable shadow. For a pharaoh, to rule absolutely meant to live in a world where no one said no, where every whim became law, and every fear could be answered with execution. Surrounded by flatterers, guarded from truth, and worshipped as a deity, the pharaoh stood not only above the people, but apart from them. And in that isolation, paranoia flourished. He trusted no one, not his priests, not his generals, not even his own family. A brother could be a rival, a son, a threat, a wife, a conspirator. And so, many pharaohs ruled with suspicion, watching their courts for signs of betrayal, rewarding loyalty with riches and crushing dissent without mercy. The further they climbed into divinity, the less human they became. Some turned their courts into cults, demanding not just obedience, but adoration. Others covered their cities with statues of themselves, 1,000 stone eyes watching from every corner. They built colossal temples not to the gods, but to their own names. They declared their own birthdays as national festivals. Some even altered religious doctrine to elevate themselves above the gods they once served. But such unchecked power never came without consequence. The more a pharaoh tried to become eternal, the more he revealed his greatest fear, that even gods can be forgotten. This is the story of pharaohs who ruled too long, built too high, and trusted too little. It is the story of kings who tried to become gods and found only darkness. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in the golden heart of the ancient world. The wind stirs warm sand beneath your feet. The sun beats down, unyielding and divine. Before you, rising like mountains crafted by gods, are the pyramids, massive, eternal, impossible. You are in Egypt, but not the Egypt of tourists and postcards. This is Egypt of 3,000 years ago, a land of mystery, and men who were worshipped as gods. This is the world of the pharaohs. The pharaoh was more than a king. He was believed to be a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed deity, and after death, the soul of Osiris himself, the ruler of the underworld. His breath kept the sun in the sky. His voice calmed the Nile. His rituals ensured the crops would grow and the people would be fed. But such power came at a terrible price. For every golden crown, there was a crown of thorns, made not of wood, magic, but of expectation, fear, and the unrelenting burden of divinity. From the moment he rose each morning, the pharaoh's life was scripted. First came the sacred bath, using holy water from the Nile, poured by priests with trembling hands. Then came the oils, frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, rubbed into his skin to purify him, to anoint him not just as ruler, but as the cosmic axis on which the world spun. His eyes were lined with black coal, not for vanity, but to protect him from evil spirits and the burning gaze of the sun god, Ra. Then, dressed in linen and wrapped in symbols of power, the crook of the shepherd, the flail of punishment, the crown of dual lands, he emerged not as a man, but as a force of nature. But for all the splendor, the pharaoh was not free. He could not act on whim. Every word he spoke was recorded, every step he took observed. His meals, his sleep, his dreams, all had meaning. If he entered a temple with the wrong foot, it was an omen. If his shadow fell across the altar, it was disaster. The gods watched always, and so did his enemies. Within the towering walls of the palace, danger brewed like poison in golden cups. Power attracts ambition. Wives vied for influence. Sons plotted succession. Brothers whispered betrayal. Pharaohs were often surrounded by harems, hundreds of women, from noble daughters to foreign princesses, all hoping to bear the next king. But in this luxurious cage, rivalry turned deadly. A glance, A word, a moment of weakness could cost a queen her place or her life. Some, like Queen Nefertari, wielded immense power, sharing in her husband Ramses II's rule. Others, like Queen Tai, the wife of Amenhotep III, advised her husband from the shadows and influenced state policy. But for every queen who thrived, another fell. The palace was a battlefield, soaked not in blood but in perfume and politics. Even more disturbing were the incestuous marriages, brother marrying sister, father marrying daughter, all to preserve the sacred bloodline. Pharaohs believed their divinity was inherited, and that mingling with common blood would dilute it. The result? Generations plagued by genetic defects. Tutankhamun, the famed boy king, was the product of such unions, born with a club foot, a cleft palate, and a fragile immune system. He died at just 19, buried with golden chariots he could never ride, and weapons he may never have wielded. But even death was not an escape from duty. For the pharaoh, death was merely the next chapter, a journey into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. But to get there, he needed help. Not prayers alone, servants. In the earliest dynasties, pharaohs like Jur and Den were buried with their court. Musicians, cooks, guards, all sacrificed to serve him in the afterlife. Their bodies were placed in neat rows, hands folded, eyes closed forever. Even animals, beloved pets and sacred beasts, were not spared. Dogs, monkeys, lions, even baboons were mummified and laid beside their masters. Some tombs revealed walls stacked with hair, offerings of beauty and purity to the god Anubis. It was devotion, yes, but it was also power, taken to its most chilling extreme. Later, Egyptians would replace living sacrifices with shaptas, small figurines meant to magically come to life and work for the king beyond death. But the intention remained the same. The pharaoh's comfort, even in eternity, came first. And what of the monuments? The Great Pyramids were not temples to the gods, but tombs. Enormous tombs. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu, stood over 480 feet tall, constructed with over 2 million stones. Each block was hauled, carved, and placed without the aid of wheels or steel. It took decades, tens of thousands of workers, toiling under the sun, their names forgotten, so that one man could live forever. Later pharaohs like Ramses II built entire cities around their mortuary temples. Ramses's tomb, the Ramesseum, was filled with treasures, golden thrones, alabaster jars, his mummified lion, and, it's believed, even sacrificed concubines. His image, colossal and stern, stares down from temples across Egypt, etched in stone, daring time to forget him. But time forgets. It always does. Tombs were robbed. Names were chiseled off walls. Mummies burned or stolen. Even Ramses's body was moved, hidden, reburied, until it finally surfaced centuries later in a crumbling wooden box. The face of a god, now dust-covered and dry. And yet, they endure. The pharaohs haunt our dreams. They captivate our stories. They stand as testaments to human ambition and to its cost. For while they claimed divinity, they were, in the end, flesh and bone. They feared, they bled, they died. Perhaps that is their most lasting legacy. Not the pyramids, not the gold, not even their names, but the reminder that no matter how high we climb, we remain human. And in that humanity lies our true story. So when you next see the golden mask of Tutankhamun or gaze at the face of the Sphinx, remember, you are not just looking at history. You are speaking the name of the dead, and in doing so, you bring them back to life. The pharaohs built for eternity, and in a way, they succeeded. Inside the golden walls, a day in the luxurious life of a pharaoh. Behind the towering gates of Egypt's royal palaces, hidden from the eyes of commoners and foreigners alike, life unfolded in splendor almost beyond imagination. These were not mere palaces. They were divine sanctuaries, cosmic command centers, and golden prisons all at once. For within them resided the pharaoh, the living god, whose every breath was sacred, whose every need was fulfilled by an army of attendants, artisans, priests, and slaves. His daily life was a dance of luxury, ceremony, and divine symbolism, woven together by generations of tradition and belief. From the moment the sun's first rays crept over the horizon, casting golden light onto the polished limestone walls of the palace, the pharaoh's chambers stirred into silent, meticulous action. He did not wake alone. Dozens of silent-footed servants had already been moving for hours, preparing his clothing, mixing his perfumes, selecting his jewels. At the edge of the room, his body attendants, young, loyal, and carefully trained, awaited the precise moment they would begin the ritual of awakening. It was no simple stretch and yawn. It was a carefully orchestrated sequence of purification and glorification. A sacred copper basin of Nile water, chilled and scented with lotus, awaited beside the royal bed. One servant would gently sprinkle the water while another recited hymns to Ra, the sun god, thanking him for returning the king's soul from the world of dreams. The pharaoh would then be washed, dried with fine linen towels spun by temple virgins, and anointed with sacred oils, myrrh, frankincense, cedar, cinnamon, each with its own magical properties. A dab under each eye, a circle around the heart, a trail down each limb. His body was not merely cleaned, it was consecrated. After purification came the dressing. The pharaoh's attire changed depending on the ritual calendar and political needs of the day. Was he appearing as Horus, the falcon god, or as Osiris, ruler of the dead? Would he visit a temple or receive foreign dignitaries? His garments were embroidered with gold thread and semi-precious stones, turquoise, lapis lazuli, carnelian, symbols of power, protection, and eternal life. Bracelets, amulets, and collars were fitted by expert hands, their placement dictated by ancient priestly texts. His crown, sometimes the red crown of Lower Egypt, sometimes the white of Upper Egypt, sometimes both in union, was placed last, a final act of coronation for each new day. Beyond his private chambers lay the great colonnaded halls of the palace, where sunlight streamed through intricately carved windows, casting patterns across floors inlaid with alabaster and mother-of-pearl. Fountains gurgled softly in gardens where peacocks strutted and trained baboons perched on polished railings. Perfumed air carried the sound of harps, lyres, and flutes, played by blind musicians who had spent their lives in the palace for that single divine purpose, to soothe the ears of a god. The palace itself was a city within a city. Inside its walls were scribes' offices, archives, libraries, kitchens, workshops, armories, and quarters for the thousands who served the pharaoh. There were cooks who prepared dozens of dishes daily from the finest meats, fruits, and grains the Nile Valley could offer. There were bakers who shaped bread into sacred forms, perfumers who maintained the scent of divinity in every hall, and artists who immortalized the king's deeds in bas-reliefs of radiant color. Each individual had a role, and each role revolved around one person, the pharaoh. When the pharaoh appeared, it was never casually. He emerged like the sun at dawn, accompanied by guards in ceremonial armor, priests swinging incense, and dancers who moved in slow, reverent rhythms. Every member of the court lowered themselves to the floor, bowing until the king passed. He did not walk quickly, nor slowly, but with the steady gait of one who walked in two worlds, mortal and divine. His morning might begin in the palace shrine, a temple within a temple, where he offered incense and gifts to the gods. These rituals were not optional, they were essential. If the pharaoh did not honor the gods might withdraw their favor from Egypt. And so, the palace's most luxurious room, the king's own chapel, was often the most serious, echoing with hymns, prayers, and the deep, otherworldly tones of temple chants. Once spiritual duties were fulfilled, the pharaoh might move to the audience hall, a vast chamber where foreign emissaries, regional governors, generals, and priests sought his judgment or favor. Here, seated on a golden throne encrusted with lapis and shaped like a lion, the pharaoh listened with quiet majesty as his vizier read reports and issued petitions. When the pharaoh spoke, his words were final. No appeal, no debate. His decisions were carved into stone, both literally and symbolically. His mouth did not utter thoughts, it spoke fate. And yet, amidst all this ceremony and burden, the pharaoh was also a man who indulged in every luxury known to his age. Meals were feasts: roasted duck, honeyed dates, spiced lentils, and wine from the delta served in crystal goblets. Servants fanned him with palm fronds, anointed his hands with scented oils, and filled the air with soft music. In his leisure hours, he might ride a gilded chariot through palace gardens, hunt antelope in royal preserves, or float down the Nile on a barge with sails dyed purple and red, surrounded by singing girls and perfumed courtiers. His harem, housed in a separate wing of the palace, was not just a place of pleasure but of political intrigue. Daughters of nobles, foreign princesses, and hand-picked beauties lived in a world of strict etiquette and endless competition, each hoping to bear the next heir. These women were tended to by hundreds of nurses, guards, tutors, and scribes, forming a private world as elaborate as the palace itself. At night, the pharaoh returned to his chamber, the air cooled by stone, the walls painted with stars, the bed carved with spells for protection in the dream world. As sleep approached, priests stood nearby, recording his dreams, believed to be messages from the gods. Even in rest, the pharaoh's mind walked among spirits and stars. Such was his life, a cycle of glory and responsibility, worship and indulgence, gilded beauty and crushing expectation, surrounded by thousands, yet alone, served by the many, but ruled by the weight of eternity. Bound by the divine, rituals, superstitions, and sacred duties of a pharaoh. Yet for all the opulence, for every golden statue and perfumed chamber, the life of a pharaoh was not one of personal freedom. It was not a life of idle leisure or untethered luxury. On the contrary, the pharaoh was bound, not by chains, but by the invisible weight of ritual, superstition, and sacred obligation. Every day, every hour, even every gesture he made, was governed by religious codes and cosmic expectations passed down through centuries. To the outside world, the pharaoh appeared all-powerful, a living god walking the earth. But behind that divine mask was a man constantly watched by priests, bound to ancient texts and ceremonial calendars. His thoughts, dreams, movements, and decisions were measured not by personal will, but by what the gods demanded, what the stars foretold, and what sacred law allowed. The Egyptian worldview was one of profound spiritual order. They believed that the universe functioned according to a principle called Ma'at, a divine balance encompassing truth, justice, harmony, and cosmic stability. The pharaoh was not only expected to uphold Ma'at in courtrooms and battlefields, but in his own body and soul. If he faltered, Ma'at would crumble. The Nile might not flood, plagues might fall, famine might spread. The balance of the world rested on one man's unwavering devotion to order. To maintain this order, the pharaoh had to perform dozens of daily rituals, many of them elaborate, mystical, and steeped in centuries of symbolism. He had to visit temples on specific days, recite ancient hymns in specific tones, wear certain colors at certain phases of the moon. Even how he breathed during ceremonies was dictated by the high priests. One of his most sacred duties was the morning temple ritual, performed at dawn in the inner sanctum of a major temple, often Karnak or Luxor. No commoner would ever witness it. Only the high priest, a handful of sacred attendants, and the pharaoh himself. The ritual involved awakening the god of the temple, often Amoniasare or Horus, by opening the shrine, washing and dressing the divine statue, anointing it with oil, offering incense, wine, and food, and reciting prayers in the language of the gods. The pharaoh had to act not as himself, but as the god Horus serving the elder gods. Every misstep risked cosmic imbalance. At certain festivals, such as the said festival, held every 30 years, the pharaoh was expected to undergo a ritual renewal of his divine strength. The festival included long processions, symbolic races, ritual dances, and acts of symbolic rebirth, sometimes even recoronation. Failure to complete these rituals would signal to the people and the gods that the king was no longer fit to rule. The pharaoh also had to consult the stars before any major action. Royal astronomer priests tracked celestial alignments from temple rooftops, interpreting omens based on the movements of Sirius, Orion, and the sun's path. If the stars were unfavorable, the pharaoh might delay a war, cancel a royal wedding, or postpone a sacred offering. But superstition didn't just dictate grand decisions. It permeated even the most mundane details of the pharaoh's life. Certain foods were avoided on certain days. Certain colors were worn to repel evil spirits. Certain animals were never to be seen at court. The pharaoh's chamber was always aligned with the stars, and his bed was carved with spells from the Book of the Dead to protect him during sleep. Every doorway was inscribed with protective hieroglyphs. Every piece of clothing had meaning, embroidered with tiny charms to ward off curses. The pharaoh could not simply speak freely either. His words, believed to carry divine power, had to be carefully chosen. A careless phrase could be seen as a prophecy. A curse uttered in anger could, according to belief, manifest into reality. Even in conversation, the pharaoh was often surrounded by scribes who recorded his speech, interpreting it as royal decree. His relationship with the priesthood was both sacred and strategic. While the pharaoh was considered the head of religion, the temples of Egypt were vast and powerful, and the priests held immense influence. Entire regions were controlled by temple estates, their wealth sometimes rivaling that of the palace. To maintain harmony, the pharaoh had to appease temple leaders, attend their ceremonies, fund their constructions, and be seen as a pious guardian of the gods. Any sign of spiritual negligence could be used against him, politically and cosmically. There were also rituals of purification before battle, where the pharaoh had to fast, pray, and bathe for days to ensure he was spiritually clean before donning the armor of a warrior god. Weapons were blessed. Chariots were inscribed with protective texts. Even the horses were fed sacred herbs to make them worthy of carrying the divine body of the king. And when the pharaoh fell ill, or worse, began to age, whispers spread. Was the god weakening? Was the favor of the heavens fading? The court would tighten. Priests would conduct more rituals, offer more sacrifices, build more altars. Sometimes, rumors of divine displeasure would lead to increased executions, secret rites, and desperate acts to restore order. The pharaoh, though surrounded by thousands, became increasingly isolated, worshipped but feared, revered yet burdened. Thus, his was a life of sacred performance. The palace was a stage. The audience, gods, priests, spirits, and ancestors. The pharaoh had to act flawlessly, day after day, never faltering, never doubting. Even his death had to follow ritual: the embalming, the burial texts, the mummification rites, the opening of the mouth ceremony, all designed to ensure the king could continue his duties in the next world. In this way, the pharaoh lived not for himself, but for the eternal machinery of divine balance. He was not free to love as he pleased, not free to speak without consequence, not free to age, to rest, to change. His entire being was offered to the gods, like incense into flame. And so, while he ruled over millions and slept in golden halls, he was, perhaps, the most imprisoned man in all of Egypt. The sacred morning, purification, anointing, and worship. Every day in the life of a pharaoh began not with casual waking, but with a sacred transformation. Dawn was not merely the start of another day, it was a divine rebirth. For the pharaoh was not just a king who ruled over people, he was a living god, and each morning he had to reclaim his divinity through a strict, ceremonial process of purification, anointing, and worship. Before the first light touched the outer walls of the palace, his most trusted attendants were already in motion, priests and servants specially trained to guide the pharaoh through his daily ritual of becoming. They moved in silence, as if the air itself was holy. The chambers were dim, lit only by soft oil lamps and perfumed with the warm, earthy scent of frankincense. In the center of this quiet world was the king's bath, not a simple tub, but a sacred basin carved of alabaster, inscribed with protective spells and symbols invoking the gods of purity. Water drawn from the Nile, collected at dawn from a spot chosen by astrologers, was brought in golden pitchers. This was not ordinary water. It had been blessed, prayed over, and was believed to carry divine power. The priests poured it slowly over the pharaoh's body, washing away not only dust or sweat, but any spiritual impurity accumulated during sleep. In their chants, They referred to him as Horus, mighty falcon, and with each wash, they spoke words of renewal. Awake, O Lord of the two lands. May your flesh be pure, your breath be divine. The cleansing was methodical and deeply symbolic. First, the head, for wisdom, then the hands, for justice, then the feet, so he may walk in truth. Finally, the heart, where the soul resided. No corner of the body was ignored, no movement was rushed. This was not mere hygiene, it was resurrection. The Pharaoh was being reborn, not from a mother's womb, but through sacred water. After bathing came the anointing, a delicate art passed down through generations of royal perfumers and priests. Oils made from lotus, cedar, myrrh, cinnamon, and blue lily were applied to the Pharaoh's skin, each with its own significance. Lotus oil for rebirth, cedar for strength, myrrh for protection in both the living and the afterlife. The oils were kept in alabaster jars sealed with wax and were opened with whispered prayers. Attendants massaged the oils into his skin, covering his limbs with sheen and scent. His hair was oiled and braided. His eyes were lined with kohl, not for beauty, but to protect against the evil eye and the harsh glare of Ra, the sun god. Once anointed, the Pharaoh was dressed in ritual garments, not mere clothing, but robes of divine office. A pleated linen kilt, pressed to perfection, a ceremonial collar of faience and gold, its blue and green tiles shimmering like the Nile under moonlight. Leather sandals with soles inscribed with the names of Egypt's enemies, so that each step he took symbolically crushed them beneath his feet. Finally, the crown, whether red, white, or double, it was placed upon his head with care, accompanied by a final prayer. May the gods crown your brow with wisdom and the stars follow your command. Then came the morning offering ceremony, perhaps the most important daily ritual. The Pharaoh would proceed to the temple, sometimes in person, sometimes in symbolic representation, and enter the Holy of Holies, where only he or the high priest could step. Here stood the cult statue of the temple's deity, sealed behind doors overnight, asleep. The Pharaoh's duty was to wake the god, cleanse the statue, clothe it, and offer food and incense, essentially serving the god as a divine servant. This exchange was more than symbolic. The gods required order and offerings to remain active in the world. Without the Pharaoh's daily rituals, the sun might not rise, the river might not flow, the harvest might fail. He was the cosmic intermediary, maintaining harmony between the divine and mortal realms. The prayers were chanted in the sacred language of the gods, a form of hieroglyphic speech only known to temple priests. Incense was burned, filling the sanctuary with fragrant smoke meant to please the senses of the deity. Bread, beer, figs, honey, and roasted meats were placed before the altar, ritually prepared, untouched by common hands. Every motion, from the lifting of the incense to the placing of the offering, followed ritual diagrams and memorized choreography. A single misstep could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. That is why only the most trusted priests, many of them raised since childhood within the temple walls, were allowed to assist in this rite. Once the god was awakened, bathed, clothed, and fed, the pharaoh or his representative would close the shrine doors again, sealing the deity for another day and exit backwards, never turning his back to the divine. Outside, trumpets would sound, and the people, seeing the smoke rise from the temple, would know Ma'at has been restored. The land would thrive another day. All was in balance. But for the pharaoh, the day was just beginning. He had renewed his role as the son of Ra. He had pleased the gods. He had been reborn from water and oil, purified by flame and prayer. Yet with that rebirth came the crushing return of duty. There were audiences to hold, judgments to render, wars to prepare, alliances to form, temples to fund, omens to interpret, and scribes to instruct. The sacred bath, the scented oils, the ritual offerings, they were not indulgences. They were burdens. They were reminders that every day, the pharaoh must earn his godhood again and again. And so the cycle repeated, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. He was not just a man. He was the bridge between worlds, held aloft not by freedom, but by flame, incense, and divine command. The law of Ma'at, the sacred balance Pharaoh could never break. In the heart of all things, above gold, beyond the reach of armies or palaces, there was Ma'at. More than a word, more than a goddess, Ma'at was the invisible thread that held the universe together. To the ancient Egyptians, Ma'at was not merely a concept of truth or order. She was the very force that separated cosmos from chaos, life from death, reality from unmaking. She was harmony itself. In the rhythm of the seasons, the rise of the Nile, the orbit of stars, and the beating of the human heart. Without Ma'at, the sun would not rise. Without Ma'at, Egypt would fall, and it was the pharaoh's divine duty to uphold her at all costs. Every law, every decree, every action taken by the pharaoh had to serve Ma'at. He was not an absolute ruler in the way later kings of history imagined themselves. No, his authority came not from ambition, but from alignment with this universal order. He did not create justice. He embodied it. He did not invent law. He enforced the divine will of Ma'at upon the land. To break Ma'at, to act with cruelty, deceit, or selfishness, was to risk plunging Egypt into Isfit, chaos, the primeval darkness that existed before creation. Isfit was not simply disorder. It was the undoing of existence itself. War, famine, plague, rebellion, drought. And so, even the most powerful man in the world walked a narrow path. Inside courtrooms, Ma'at took physical form. A feather, light and perfect, placed on one side of a scale in the afterlife. The heart of the dead would be weighed against it, too heavy with sin, and it would be devoured by the monstrous Ammit. But in life, the pharaoh did not wait for judgment after death. He was judged every day by the gods, the people, and history. Priests reminded him daily that his actions echoed into the heavens. Farmers believed that if the pharaoh ruled unjustly, the Nile would refuse to flood. Scribes recorded his words not just as law, but as living proof of whether or not he walked in truth. Even nature itself was seen as responding to the pharaoh's alignment with Ma'at. A sudden eclipse? A bad omen? A poor harvest? Perhaps the king had sinned in silence. Thus, the pharaoh's court became a theater of ritualized justice. He listened to disputes among nobles, read petitions from villagers, and settled inheritance cases between widows and sons. Not because he needed to, but because Ma'at required it. The smallest injustice, left unaddressed, might fester into divine anger. Mercy and balance were not virtues, they were obligations. And it went beyond politics. Ma'at governed architecture, temples aligned to the sun and stars, roads traced along sacred lines, tombs angled to the cardinal points. It shaped language. Scribes who composed hymns or carved decrees had to use balanced structures, symmetrical lines, and sacred phrasing. Even art bowed to her law. Human figures had to be drawn with heads in profile but shoulders forward, a symbolic balance between physical truth and spiritual essence. In battle, Pharaoh fought not for conquest or ego, but for the defense of Ma'at. Every foreign enemy, whether Libyan, Nubian, or Hittite, was painted not just as an opponent of Egypt, but as an enemy of cosmic order. In carvings, the pharaoh was shown smiting them beneath his sandals, trampling chaos with each stride. These images were not propaganda. They were sacred acts, declarations to the gods that Egypt remained in balance. Yet the greatest struggle with Ma'at was internal. The pharaoh had to govern himself before he could govern the land. He was expected to live with dignity, self-control, purity of thought. Lust, greed, wrath, these were cracks in the foundation of the world. Even his dreams were interpreted by temple priests to ensure his soul was in harmony. A troubled dream might require a week of ritual purification, fasting, or offerings to atone for unseen imbalance. In times of crisis, natural disasters, plagues, or rebellion, the question was always the same. Has Ma'at been broken? And if so, was the pharaoh still worthy to rule? Some pharaohs faced this judgment in life. Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king, who dared to defy the ancient gods and build a monotheistic cult around Aten, the sun disk, was seen as a violator of Ma'at. After his death, his name was erased, his statues destroyed, his city abandoned. Even his mummy may have been hidden, denied the afterlife. He had broken the balance, and Egypt punished him in this life and the next. Others, like Hatshepsut, were tested more subtly. As a female pharaoh ruling in a world of men, she had to prove doubly that she upheld Ma'at, not just through temple offerings, but through building projects, trade expeditions, and peacekeeping. She restored temples, rebuilt shrines, and invoked Ma'at at every turn. History remembers her not as a usurper, but as a restorer of balance. In the end, Ma'at was the one force the pharaoh could not escape. Riches could not bribe her. Armies could not defeat her. Even death was not the end, for when the pharaoh stood before Osiris in the Hall of Judgment, his heart would again be weighed against the feather of truth. Only those who had ruled in balance, who had honored the sacred rhythm of the world, could pass into the eternal field of reeds. And so, each step the pharaoh took was not just a walk through time, but a tightrope across eternity. He lived, not for himself, but for the world. He bore the crown, not for glory, but for harmony. And long after his monuments crumbled, long after his name faded from stone, the question would remain: did he walk in Ma'at? The obsession with immortality and the haunting rituals of death. To the pharaohs, death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a second, eternal existence. Unlike the common man, whose soul might fade into the winds of the desert or vanish into forgotten tombs, the pharaoh was destined to live forever. But such immortality was not guaranteed. It had to be earned. It had to be built, stone by stone, scroll by scroll, sacrifice by sacrifice. This obsession with eternity shaped everything. Every pyramid, every temple, every statue carved in their image was a desperate attempt to cheat time, to defy decay and remain present in the world of the living. To be forgotten was the ultimate death, but to be remembered, that was divinity secured. Yet the road to eternity was dark and perilous. The pharaoh's soul, upon leaving his body, had to embark on a dangerous journey through the underworld, a realm filled with monsters, gates of fire, and divine judges. Only the pure could pass. Only the prepared could survive. And so, the preparations for death began long before the first wrinkle appeared on a pharaoh's face. His tomb was not simply a burial chamber. It was a cosmic fortress designed to protect his body, store his riches, and house his soul. But it required more than architecture. It required rituals, many of them unsettling to modern eyes. The living would be killed to accompany the dead. Bodies of servants, pets, even wives were sealed into stone with their lord. Food, weapons, perfume, and scrolls were entombed not as decoration, but as necessities for the afterlife. Immortality came at a terrible cost. And for the pharaoh, the pursuit of eternal life was not a peaceful dream, but a lifelong ritual of blood, fear, and faith. The blood price of eternity, human sacrifice in the early pharaohs' tombs. In the earliest dynasties of ancient Egypt, long before pyramids touched the clouds or golden masks covered royal faces, the path to eternity was paved not only with stone and faith, but with blood. To modern minds, the idea is chilling, that when a pharaoh died, dozens, even hundreds of people were buried alive or killed to follow him into the afterlife. But to the ancients, this was not murder. It was devotion. It was necessary. It was the highest honor, to continue serving the divine king even beyond death. In the first dynasty, over 5,000 years ago, this belief was woven tightly into Egyptian funerary customs. The pharaoh was not merely the ruler of the living. He was the son of gods, the source of order, the link between heaven and earth. When he died, he did not vanish into soil. He ascended to the stars. But like any ruler, he required servants, advisors, guards, and entertainers to sustain his rule in the world beyond. How could a god-king rule alone? And so, human sacrifice became part of the royal burial rite. The evidence lies beneath the sand, especially at Abydos, one of Egypt's most sacred burial sites. Archaeologists have uncovered royal tombs surrounded by dozens of smaller graves, some filled with skeletal remains of healthy young adults, buried simultaneously. These subsidiary graves, known as retainer burials, often held no personal artifacts, no offerings, no signs of mourning. Instead, they appear uniform, organized, systematic. In the tomb of King Jur, believed to be one of the earliest pharaohs of Egypt's first dynasty, circa 3000 BCE, excavators found over 300 subsidiary burials surrounding the royal chamber. Some of the bodies showed signs of careful arrangement, lying flat, hands at their sides, facing the same direction. Others were interred with musical instruments or food vessels, suggesting their roles in court. These individuals were not buried with family. They were buried with their king. But how did they die? There is no clear consensus. Some may have been strangled, poisoned, or ritually suffocated. Others might have walked willingly into the tomb, accepting their fate as sacred duty. A few skulls show evidence of trauma, but the overall lack of struggle suggests the practice may have been consensual, or at least ceremonial, rather than violent slaughter. The logic behind the act was rooted in Egypt's most profound belief: life after death mirrored life on earth. The pharaoh, now a god in the afterlife, would still need food, clothing, song, protection. The same attendants who dressed him in the morning, who played the harp during his feasts, who poured wine at court, these were the ones chosen to follow him. For the chosen, this was not just death, it was eternity in royal service. To ensure this transition was complete, funeral rituals were precise and deeply spiritual. Magical spells, carved onto ivory wands or written on linen, were used to seal the bond between king and servant. Priests may have performed incantations to cleanse the victims' souls and guide them through the perilous journey across the underworld. It was believed that without their presence, the pharaoh's power in the afterlife would be weakened, and Egypt itself would be vulnerable to chaos. This practice wasn't unique to Egypt. Sumerian kings, Chinese emperors, and Mesoamerican rulers also buried servants with them. But in Egypt, the ritual had an especially divine context. It wasn't about ownership. It was about cosmic responsibility. The pharaoh could not abandon his divine order, even in death. Yet, this practice didn't last forever. By the middle of the Second Dynasty, the tradition of human sacrifice began to vanish. Why? Scholars offer many theories. Perhaps the moral philosophy of Ma'at, centered on harmony and justice, clashed with the growing horror of killing the innocent. Perhaps the growing power of the priesthood offered alternative spiritual tools. Perhaps society began to see the pharaoh not as a man who needed servants, but as a god who needed symbols instead. By the time of the Old Kingdom, during the golden age of pyramid building, the pharaohs no longer took people with them into the tomb. Instead, they took statues, known as shaptis or ashaptis. These small figurines were crafted in the image of ideal workers, holding tools, carrying baskets, standing ready. Inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, these figures were believed to come to life in the afterlife, performing tasks in place of real people. A pharaoh might be buried with hundreds of them, lined up in perfect ranks like a ghostly labor force. They were made of faience, stone, or wood, sometimes even gold. Thus, the symbolic replaced the literal. And with that, Egypt stepped away from the blood-soaked rituals of its earliest kings. Still, the memory of those first sacrifices lingers. It reminds us that even the greatest civilizations are born in contradiction, beauty alongside brutality, wisdom beside superstition. The Egyptians gave us art, architecture, medicine, mathematics, but also carried out acts of chilling devotion, guided not by cruelty, but by a different understanding of life and death. To judge them by modern eyes is to miss the point. These early pharaohs believed, truly believed, that death was not the end, and that sacrifice was not loss. It was a bridge, a gift, a sacred duty. So when you stand before the ruins of Abydos, or gaze at the shattered stones of Jur's tomb, know that you are not just looking at the grave of a king. You are standing where hundreds chose to follow him into eternity, not out of fear, but out of faith. The blood price of eternity, human sacrifice in the early pharaohs' tombs. In the earliest dynasties of ancient Egypt, long before pyramids touched the clouds or golden masks covered royal faces, The path to eternity was paved not only with stone and faith, but with blood. To modern minds, the idea is chilling that when a pharaoh died, dozens, even hundreds of people were buried alive or killed to follow him into the afterly servants in clay. The rise of the Shabdi and the end of blood sacrifice. As the dynasties of Egypt advanced and civilization matured, so too did its approach to death, duty, and the afterlife. While the earliest kings had their servants killed and buried with them to serve in the world beyond, the later pharaohs found a different solution, one that required no blood, no loss of life, but carried just as much spiritual weight. The answer came in the form of small, unassuming figures called Shabtis, also known as Ashabtis or Shawabdis. At first glance, they might appear to be nothing more than ornamental dolls or statuettes, tucked into royal tombs among golden amulets and canopic jars. But these tiny effigies carried a powerful, sacred purpose. They were servants for the afterlife, magically charged to perform labor on behalf of the deceased pharaoh or noble. The idea was elegant and deeply spiritual. According to ancient Egyptian belief, the afterlife was not a place of endless leisure. It was a continuation of the earthly world, filled with tasks, responsibilities, and rituals. The dead would be required to plow fields, irrigate crops, transport goods, and participate in religious ceremonies. These were not symbolic chores. They were seen as real duties that kept the cosmic balance in place, even beyond death. But pharaohs, as divine beings, could not be expected to dig trenches or haul grain. That labor, even in the next world, had to be delegated. And so, the Shabdi was born. Originally, Shabtis were simple in form, small human figures carved from wood, clay, or stone, often no more than a few inches tall. Their arms were crossed over their chests, and they typically held agricultural tools, hoes, baskets, mattocks, symbolizing their readiness to work. Over time, they became more refined, more standardized, and more numerous. By the Middle Kingdom, circa 2055 to 1650 BCE, Shabtis had become essential components of elite burials. And by the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BCE, pharaohs were being buried with hundreds, sometimes even over 1,000, Shabdi figurines, each carefully placed in rows, like a miniature army of laborers awaiting orders. What made the Shabtis more than just grave goods were the magical texts inscribed on their bodies. Usually carved or painted in hieroglyphs, the inscriptions contained a spell, often from Chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead, which activated the figure in the afterlife. The most common incantation read, "O Shabdi, if I am called upon to do any work in the afterlife, be it irrigating fields or transporting sand or any labor demanded of me, answer, here I am, and do the work on my behalf." In other words, these were not just statues. They were magical proxies, ready to spring to life when the gods summoned labor from the deceased. If the pharaoh was called to dig a canal in the field of reeds, a Shabdi would do it instead. If Osiris demanded tribute, a Shabdi would carry it. And if enemies or obstacles rose in the spirit world, perhaps the pharaoh's guardian Shabdis would even protect him. To ensure full coverage, some tombs included supervisor Shabdis, larger or more detailed figures who carried staffs instead of tools, overseeing groups of 10. These overseer figurines reflected Egypt's deep bureaucratic structure, ensuring that even in the next world, there was order, delegation, and hierarchy. While originally reserved for royalty and the highest nobility, Shabtis eventually became common in many burials. Wealthy merchants, scribes, and priests began including them in their tombs, some hiring entire workshops to craft full sets. They were made from stone, faience, wood, and in rare cases, precious metals. Pharaoh Tutankhamun, for example, was buried with over 400 Shabtis, each of them unique, painted, and inscribed, many carved in the image of the boy king himself. This symbolic shift, from real human sacrifice to enchanted figurines, marked an evolution in both morality and metaphysical thinking. Where earlier dynasties had relied on blood to secure eternity, later Egyptians turned to magic, craftsmanship, and religious texts. The spiritual economy of the afterlife expanded. Now, salvation could be purchased not in lives, but in spells and symbols. The Shabdi represented something more than convenience. They were the merging of faith, ritual, and art. They offered comfort to the dead, ensuring they would not be summoned to toil under a burning sun in the other world. And for the living, they were proof of religious innovation, a way to honor tradition without sacrificing ethics. In a society where Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth and justice, was paramount, replacing blood with clay was more than practical. It was sacred progress. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about the Shabdis is this: though they were lifeless, mute, and small, they held immense symbolic power. They stood for loyalty beyond death, for the undying duty of a subject to their king. They were, in essence, echoes of the old sacrifices, echoes that had been softened, transformed, and encoded into a more peaceful form. Instead of blood, there was faience. Instead of cries, there were spells. But the purpose remained: to serve, to protect, and to follow their Pharaoh forever. In time, the Shabdi tradition faded. The late period saw a decline in both quantity and quality, and by the Greco-Roman era, the practice had largely disappeared. But their legacy endures. Thousands of these small figurines rest today in museums across the world. Some are cracked and faded. Others still shine in shades of deep blue and emerald green. All of them carry the same silent promise: here I am. In the end, these tiny servants, humble in form but mighty in meaning, tell us as much about ancient Egypt as the grandest pyramid ever could. They reveal a culture that wrestled with death, reinvented sacrifice, and found immortality not through violence, but through belief, imagination, and magic. Faith. But to the ancients, this was not murder. It was devotion. It was necessary. It was the highest honor, to continue serving the divine king even beyond death. In the first dynasty, over 5,000 years ago, this belief was woven tightly into Egyptian funerary customs. The pharaoh was not merely the ruler of the living. He was the son of gods, the source of order, the link between heaven and earth. When he died, he did not vanish into soil. He ascended to the stars. But like any ruler, he required servants, advisors, guards, and entertainers to sustain his rule in the world beyond. How could a god-king rule alone? And so, human sacrifice became part of the royal burial rite. The evidence lies beneath the sand, especially at Abydos, one of Egypt's most sacred burial sites. Archaeologists have uncovered royal tombs surrounded by dozens of smaller graves, some filled with skeletal remains of healthy young adults, buried simultaneously. These subsidiary graves, known as retainer burials, often held no personal artifacts, no offerings, no signs of mourning. Instead, they appear uniform, organized, systematic. In the tomb of King Jur, believed to be one of the earliest pharaohs of Egypt's first dynasty, circa 3000 BCE, excavators found over 300 subsidiary burials surrounding the royal chamber. Some of the bodies showed signs of careful arrangement, lying flat, hands at their sides, facing the same direction. Others were interred with musical instruments or food vessels, suggesting their roles in court. These individuals were not buried with family. They were buried with their king. But how did they die? There is no clear consensus. Some may have been strangled, poisoned, or ritually suffocated. Others might have walked willingly into the tomb, accepting their fate as sacred duty. A few skulls show evidence of trauma, but the overall lack of struggle suggests the practice may have been consensual, or at least ceremonial, rather than violent slaughter. The logic behind the act was rooted in Egypt's most profound belief: life after death mirrored life on earth. The pharaoh, now a god in the afterlife, would still need food, clothing, song, protection. The same attendants who dressed him in the morning, who played the harp during his feasts, who poured wine at court, these were the ones chosen to follow him. For the chosen, this was not just death, it was eternity in royal service. To ensure this transition was complete, funeral rituals were precise and deeply spiritual. Tombs of power, monuments to fear, the pyramids and the Valley of the Kings. Among the golden sands and sunlit silence of Egypt stand structures that defy time itself. monuments of staggering scale and ambition. The pyramids of Giza and the Valley of the Kings are not merely burial sites. They are testaments to the power of men who called themselves gods, and to the deep, inescapable fear that even gods must one day die. In ancient Egypt, death was never accepted as an end. It was an enemy to be conquered, outwitted, or at least held at bay. And no one feared it more, or fought harder against it, than the pharaohs. Their tombs were weapons, not against armies or rivals, but against the oblivion that waited beyond the final breath. They were designed to preserve the body, protect the soul, and project power into eternity. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, remains the most iconic of them all. Over 480 feet tall in its prime and constructed from more than 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing several tons. It was the tallest human-made structure on Earth for over 3,800 years. The precision of its design, the mathematical harmony of its alignment to the stars, and the sheer labor involved in its creation speak of one thing: absolute, divine authority. But beneath that authority was a haunting desperation. The pyramid wasn't just built to glorify a king. It was built to hide him, to shield his body from time, decay, and thieves. Inside the pyramid, the king's chamber was buried deep within layers of stone, protected by false passages, granite plugs, and narrow corridors designed to confuse and trap intruders. The goal was not only to guard his treasure, but to preserve his body, the sacred vessel needed for rebirth in the afterlife. For in Egyptian belief, immortality required a whole, uncorrupted corpse. If the body was lost, the soul, the Ka, the Ba, the Ak, could not find its way home. The pharaoh, despite being divine, feared this fate more than anything. And so he summoned the greatest minds, architects, engineers, and priests of his time to create a fortress against death itself. As centuries passed, pyramids grew smaller. Their grandeur diminished, but not their symbolism. They remained towering affirmations of kingship, order, and the pharaoh's struggle against impermanence. Yet over time, these massive tombs also became targets. Robbers, lured by stories of gold and priceless goods, broke into many of them, sometimes within years of their sealing. The vulnerability of the pyramids gave rise to a new idea: secrecy over spectacle. And so, by the time of the New Kingdom, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE, pharaohs abandoned the open sands of Giza and chose a remote, rocky valley near Thebes for their burials, a place that would become known as the Valley of the Kings. Hidden among cliffs and shadows, these tombs were carved deep into the mountainside, accessible only by narrow, winding paths. They were not built to impress the living, but to protect the dead. Inside, the tombs were marvels of art and theology. Long corridors led to burial chambers adorned with vibrant wall paintings, telling stories from the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, and the Book of Gates, texts that mapped the pharaoh's perilous journey through the underworld. These images were not decorative. They were magical instructions, meant to guide the soul past demons, serpents, and gates guarded by fire and judgment. They showed the sun god Ra merging with Osiris in the Duat, the river of night. They depicted the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at. They were prayers in pigment, spells in stone. Each tomb was a blend of engineering and mysticism. Rooms were aligned to sacred geometry. Ceilings were painted with stars, so the pharaoh could navigate the sky. Amulets were hidden in wall crevices. Secret chambers were built for priests to place offerings after burial. The goal was always the same: to give the pharaoh every possible advantage in the afterlife. Yet even here, death could not be cheated completely. Tomb robbers eventually found their way into the valley, stripping many graves of their treasures. Some tombs were desecrated, their contents scattered. Others were reused, recycled by later kings or priests. In response, priests of the 21st dynasty began secretly relocating royal mummies, hiding them in cache tombs deep in cliffs and caves to protect them from theft. It is thanks to this act that modern archaeologists later found the remains of great kings like Seti I, Ramses II, and Thutmose III, mummified, but displaced from their sacred homes. Still, one tomb remained almost untouched for over 3,000 years, that of Tutankhamun. Discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, it revealed over 5,000 artifacts, golden chariots, thrones, amulets, wine jars, perfumes, food, and of course, the now iconic golden mask. Tutankhamun's tomb, though small, stunned the world, not just because of its wealth, but because it revealed the depth of the pharaoh's fear and preparation for death. Each object had a purpose. Each item was a tool. Nothing was placed by accident. Even folded linen garments and combs were laid in with intention, to comfort, to protect, to serve. And so, whether under the desert sun of Giza or the hidden cliffs of Thebes, the tombs of the pharaohs stand as paradoxes, monuments to power, born of fear. They shout eternal strength, yet whisper mortal dread. They are larger than life, yet obsessed with what comes after it. In them we see the heart of ancient Egypt, a civilization that feared chaos, worshipped order, and believed that death, though inevitable, could be negotiated with stone, magic, and will. And perhaps, in some way, they were right. For as long as these tombs still stand, and as long as their names are spoken, the pharaohs, Khufu, Seti, Ramses, Tutankhamun, do not truly sleep. They endure. The royal family, a realm of rivalry and incest. Behind the golden walls of the Egyptian palaces, beyond the incense-filled halls and glittering throne rooms, lay a world far more fragile and far more dangerous. The royal family of Egypt, revered by the people and blessed by the gods, was not a sanctuary of peace. It was a palace built on ambition, fear, and blood. To the outside world, the pharaoh stood alone, majestic, divine, untouchable. But in truth, he was surrounded by a complex web of queens, concubines, half-brothers, scheming priests, and ambitious children, each with their own desires, each a potential threat to the crown. Royal love was rarely romantic. It was political. Marriage was not about passion or companionship. It was about power, inheritance, and keeping the bloodline pure. And so came one of the most controversial practices in Egyptian royal tradition: incestuous marriage. Pharaohs routinely married their sisters, and in some cases, their daughters, not out of desire, but out of religious obligation. The gods had married their siblings, so too must their divine representatives on earth. This was not seen as taboo, but as holy. To unite with one's sister was to mirror the celestial union of Isis and Osiris. It was a ritual, a symbol of legitimacy. Yet such unions came with a price, both biological and political. Children born from these marriages were often sickly or deformed. Tutankhamun, the boy king whose tomb would later astonish the world, was the product of a sibling union, and his body bore the evidence: a club foot, spinal issues, and a fragile immune system. Inside the harem walls, jealousy and betrayal simmered. Multiple wives, concubines, and royal children competed for influence and succession. Inheritance was never guaranteed. Assassinations, poisonings, and silent disappearances were whispered behind veils and silken curtains. The throne of Egypt may have appeared unshakable to the outside world, but within the palace, it stood on shifting sands. This is the story of the pharaoh's family, a world of divine blood and human weakness, where the greatest danger came not from outside invaders, but from those who shared your name. The sacred bloodline, incestuous marriages in the royal house of Egypt. In the great courts of ancient Egypt, where gold gleamed on every pillar and incense wafted through the marble halls, one rule above all guided the fate of the throne: keep the blood divine. For the pharaohs, regarded not merely as kings, but as gods incarnate, it was not enough to rule by divine right. One had to be divine by blood. And in the logic of the ancient world, there was only one way to guarantee that: marry within. Not simply within the royal family, but within the immediate royal line. That meant brothers marrying sisters. Sometimes, fathers taking their own daughters as queens. A practice that to modern eyes may appear grotesque or unnatural was, to the ancient Egyptian mind, sacred and necessary. This was not hidden or scandalous. It was celebrated. The model came from the gods themselves. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris married his sister, Isis, and together they birthed Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship. If the gods did so, then Pharaoh, their son and representative on earth, was duty-bound to mirror their union. To dilute the royal bloodline by marrying a non-royal, even a noble, was to weaken the throne's claim to divinity. Only a sister, born of the same divine womb, could truly be worthy of the king. Thus, royal records from dynasty after dynasty reveal a pattern. Pharaohs naming their sisters and half-sisters as great royal wives, a title of immense prestige. These marriages were often political as well as theological. In a court filled with secondary wives, foreign princesses, and concubines, only the great royal wife, usually a sister, could bear the son with the strongest claim to the throne. The most famous example may be Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king, who not only married his beautiful sister Nefertiti, but is also believed by some scholars to have taken his own daughter as a consort in the final years of his reign. This was not merely lust or madness. Akhenaten was attempting to establish a divine lineage unlike any before, a family that mirrored the gods not only in power, but in form and function. But the consequences of this practice, over generations, became biologically devastating. One of the clearest cases was Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's likely son. DNA studies in the 21st century confirmed that his parents were full siblings. The result? Tutankhamun, though a king, was a physically fragile young man. He suffered from a clubfoot, a cleft palate, scoliosis, and possibly a compromised immune system. He walked with a cane, several were found in his tomb, and may have died from a simple infection that his weakened body could not survive. His case was not unique. Scholars suspect that many royal children did not survive childhood. The tombs of young princesses and stillborn infants surround many of the pharaoh's burial sites. In their attempt to protect the sacred blood, the royal family may have been slowly poisoning its own future. But the practice endured. Ramses II, one of the most powerful pharaohs of all time, married several of his daughters, including Bintenath and possibly Merimnet. Their statues stand beside his, elevated as queens. No shame was attached to the act. On the contrary, it was a visible declaration that the divine bloodline remained unbroken. Still, royal incest was not without tension. Within the palace walls, power struggles brewed. Secondary wives, often foreign princesses gifted from other empires, plotted for their sons to gain favor. Rival queens formed factions, whispering into the ears of eunuchs, scribes, generals. A single glance from the pharaoh could elevate a son to heir apparent, or doom him to obscurity. And because many children were born from unions of close kin, legitimacy and health were constant concerns. A sickly boy might be passed over for a stronger but politically weaker half-brother. Intrigue was inevitable. In rare cases, queens took the throne themselves, usually when no clear male heir survived. The most renowned was Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh for over 2 decades. Though not married to her brother, she claimed divine birth, donned the royal beard, and declared herself the daughter of Amunias himself. Her rule was successful, but controversial. After her death, her name was nearly erased, perhaps by those who saw her reign as a breach of the male divine line. As Egyptian civilization matured and foreign dynasties began to rise, Nubians, Libyans, Persians, the strict rules of incestuous marriage faded. Foreign-born pharaohs lacked royal sisters to marry, and some adopted local Egyptian priestesses instead to strengthen their legitimacy. But in the golden age of Egypt, from the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom, incest was not a scandal, it was doctrine. And even as the practice diminished, its echoes lingered. The statues remain, husband and wife, brother and sister, seated together in stone, eternally serene. Inscriptions still refer to beloved of his sister, or born of the divine womb. The logic of the gods, once carved into the hearts of kings, endured long after the last temple bells were silenced. In truth, royal incest in Egypt was more than a practice. It was a symbol of eternity, divinity, and sacred rule. But like all symbols taken too far, it came with a cost. The fragility of the body beneath the golden crown, and the cracks in the divine bloodline that no priest could mend. Thrones in the shadows, rival queens, royal sons, and the wars of succession. Though the pharaoh was worshipped as a god and his rule declared eternal, his throne was anything but secure. Within the polished walls of Egypt's palaces, beneath the murals of harmony and cosmic order, a silent war raged. A war not against foreign invaders, but among his own blood. For when one man held all the power in the world, many hands reached to seize it after he was gone. Nowhere was this struggle more potent than in the inner world of the royal family, between sons born of different mothers and the women who birthed them. Egyptian pharaohs, by tradition and power, had many wives. One bore the title of Great Royal Wife, often a sister or half-sister, charged with ritual duties and the production of heirs. But alongside her were secondary wives, concubines, noble women, and foreign princesses gifted in diplomatic exchanges. Some were brought from distant lands like Nubia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Others were born in the shadowed quarters of the harem itself. Each of these women had her own court, her own servants, and, most dangerously, her own sons. And each son, by blood of the king, had a possible claim to the throne. Unlike later European monarchies, Egypt had no formal system of primogeniture. The eldest son was not always the heir. Instead, the next king was often chosen by political alliances, priestly support, military strength, or sheer manipulation. This ambiguity left the door wide open for rivalry, betrayal, and assassination. Take, for example, the tumultuous aftermath of Ramses III, a powerful king of the 20th dynasty. While he ruled for decades and expanded Egypt's influence, his final years were poisoned by internal strife. One of his secondary wives, Tai, conspired to have her son, Pintar, placed on the throne over the legitimate crown prince. This plot, known to history as the harem conspiracy, involved scribes, officials, and members of the royal harem. The goal? Kill Ramses III and install Pintar by force. But the plan was uncovered. Ramses III was mortally wounded. Some scholars say his throat was cut, and the conspirators were brought to trial. Court records reveal a rare glimpse into palace justice. Tai, Pintar, and others were found guilty. Pintar, in a final act of ritual punishment, was given the option to commit suicide, preserving some honor. His body was later discovered, contorted, mouth agape, wrapped without the usual ceremony. A prince-turned-traitor, condemned to a restless eternity. But he was not alone. Other dynasties echoed this pattern. Amenhotep III, a powerful pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, had dozens of wives and children. His queen, Tai, was politically influential, and her son, Akhenaten, eventually ascended the throne. But Akhenaten's revolutionary religious policies alienated much of the court, and after his death, a vacuum of power followed. Was Smenkhare, the short-lived pharaoh who ruled just after, his son, his brother, or a usurper? No one knows. What is known is that in the wake of Akhenaten's death, the court collapsed into infighting. Tutankhamun, likely a younger son or nephew, was placed on the throne as a child, a puppet for surviving factions. Even Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful rulers, rose to power through royal conflict. After her husband-brother Thutmose II died, the throne passed nominally to his son, Thutmose III, born of a secondary wife. Hatshepsut, his stepmother and aunt, declared herself pharaoh instead, citing her royal blood and divine birth. She ruled for over 20 years, commissioning magnificent temples and trade expeditions. But after her death, Thutmose III attempted to erase her from history. Her images were defaced, her name removed, her reign denied. The battle for legitimacy did not end at death. Within the palace, even the harem, the supposed sanctuary of the pharaoh's personal life, was a boiling cauldron of ambition. Whispered rumors, false pregnancies, forged letters, and bribed priests were tools as potent as swords. The favor of the king was everything, and queens would do anything to secure it for their children. Royal sons, too, were raised not just to serve, but to compete. Trained in warfare, politics, and theology, they were taught from an early age that only one of them would sit on the throne, and that the path there might be bathed in blood. Half-brothers dueled not with weapons, but with alliances, temple loyalties, and marriages. Even when a successor was named, his claim was not absolute. A child king could be replaced. An unpopular crown prince could be passed over. The line between heir and pretender was always shifting, always uncertain. This environment shaped not only politics, but psychology. The pharaoh was taught to trust no one, not even his brothers, not even his sons. Paranoia was baked into power. Tombs were carved with false doors, traps, and decoys, not only to fool robbers, but perhaps to guard against the ambitions of those who called him father. In the end, the royal family, meant to symbolize unity, order, and divine rule, often became the source of Egypt's greatest instability. The very structure that protected the bloodline also ensured its fracture, again and again, across generations. And so, as one pharaoh died and another rose, the palace curtains would fall and rise on a new act of royal drama. Always behind the gold and perfume, behind the statues and prayers, was a silent truth. The greatest threat to a king's crown was his own blood. Pharaohs of rebellion and power, Hatshepsut and Akhenaten. Among the long line of god kings who ruled ancient Egypt, two names stand apart, not just for their actions, but for the ways they defied every expectation, every tradition, and every law of heaven and earth. One was a woman who dared to take the throne meant for a boy. The other, a man who rewrote the very foundations of Egyptian religion, and, in doing so, nearly tore his kingdom apart. Hatshepsut, the woman who became king. In a world where kings were gods and women were queens, but never rulers, Hatshepsut broke every rule. She was born to power, the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his great royal wife, Ahmose. She married her half-brother, Thutmose II, and became queen. But when he died, the throne passed not to her, but to Thutmose III, the son of a lesser wife. He was a child, too young to rule, and so Hatshepsut was appointed regent. But she had no intention of simply waiting in the wings. Within a few years, Hatshepsut took the unprecedented step of declaring herself pharaoh. She donned the royal kilt, wore the false beard of kingship, and had her images carved in temples as a man. Her inscriptions boldly claimed she had been chosen by the god Amonius himself to rule Egypt, not as queen, not as mother of the king, but as king in her own right. Her reign lasted over 20 years, and it was one of peace, prosperity, and remarkable achievement. She oversaw massive building projects, including the magnificent temple of Deir el-Bahari, carved into the cliffs of Thebes. She re-established trade routes lost during previous reigns, sending expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt, bringing back incense, gold, ebony, and exotic animals. Art flourished. Temples were restored. Egypt thrived, but her rule came at a cost. After her death, Thutmose III returned to full power, and he began a quiet campaign to erase Hatshepsut's legacy. Her name was chiseled from monuments. Her statues were smashed. Her memory was condemned to oblivion. Why? Some believe he resented her usurpation of his throne. Others think the priesthood, offended by a woman ruling as a god king, sought to restore Ma'at by erasing the disruption. Yet Hatshepsut survived. Her temple still stands. Her mummy was rediscovered in the 21st century, and history remembers her not as an anomaly, but as one of Egypt's greatest rulers, a woman who ruled like a man, but led like no other. Akhenaten, the heretic king, and his forbidden family. If Hatshepsut challenged gender, then Akhenaten shattered faith itself. Born as Amenhotep IV, he inherited the throne during the powerful 18th dynasty, a time when Egypt's traditional gods, especially Amonius Ra, held immense power through the temples and priesthood. But Amenhotep was different. He rejected the many gods of Egypt and declared allegiance to only one, Aten, the radiant disk of the sun. He changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and launched a revolution. Temples to other gods were closed. Statues of Ammonius were defaced. A new capital, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, was built in the desert, dedicated solely to the worship of the Aten. Art transformed. Gone were the rigid, idealized forms of previous dynasties. In their place came strange, fluid images, elongated skulls, wide hips, and intimate family scenes. At the center of this world was Nefertiti, Akhenaten's powerful queen. Together, they were shown playing with their daughters under the rays of the Aten, who reached down with hands of light. It was a new theology, a monotheism in a land of polytheism, and it alienated both the people and the priesthood. But even more shocking were the rumors of incest. Some evidence, though debated, suggests Akhenaten may have married at least one of his daughters, possibly Meritaten, following the example of divine tradition taken to its most extreme. Statues, inscriptions, and burial items hint at a co-regency or even a spiritual union, though scholars remain divided. If true, this act would not have been viewed with modern disgust, but with sacred justification. A mirror of Osiris and Isis, a sealing of divine blood in an age of religious upheaval. Yet Akhenaten's vision could not last. After his death, his successor, perhaps his son, Tutankhaten, quickly renounced Atenism, restoring the old gods and changing his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Harmonious. The temples were reopened. The old priesthood returned. The city of Amarna was abandoned, left to the sand. Akhenaten's statues were smashed. His name was omitted from king lists, treated as if he had never existed. But history could not forget him. Akhenaten remains one of the most mysterious and controversial figures of ancient Egypt, a king who dreamed of light and monotheism, but whose actions sowed darkness and division. Some see him as a visionary, others a madman. All agree, he changed Egypt forever. Together, Hatshepsut and Akhenaten show the extremes of royal power in ancient Egypt, one defying gender, the other defying the gods. They ruled not by tradition, but by force of will. And though the sands of time tried to bury them, their stories endured, etched in stone, whispered in tombs, and rediscovered by a world still fascinated by their brilliance and their boldness. In the palace of divine blood, it was not enough to obey. To rise, one had to defy, and in doing so, risk becoming eternal. The darkness of absolute power. From the outside, the throne of Egypt gleamed brighter than the sun. Draped in gold, guarded by legions, praised by priests, the Pharaoh appeared untouchable, a god among men, ruling with divine right over all the lands touched by the Nile. His face adorned temples, his name echoed in prayers, and his commands carved into stone. But behind this brilliant mask lay something far more human, and far more dangerous. Absolute power does not illuminate, it casts a long and inescapable shadow. For a pharaoh, to rule absolutely meant to live in a world where no one said no, where every whim became law, and every fear could be answered with execution. Surrounded by flatterers, guarded from truth, and worshipped as a deity, the pharaoh stood not only above the people, but apart from them. And in that isolation, paranoia flourished. He trusted no one, not his priests, not his generals, not even his own family. A brother could be a rival, a son, a threat, a wife, a conspirator. And so, many pharaohs ruled with suspicion, watching their courts for signs of betrayal, rewarding loyalty with riches and crushing dissent without mercy. The further they climbed into divinity, the less human they became. Some turned their courts into cults, demanding not just obedience, but adoration. Others covered their cities with statues of themselves, 1,000 stone eyes watching from every corner. They built colossal temples not to the gods, but to their own names. They declared their own birthdays as national festivals. Some even altered religious doctrine to elevate themselves above the gods they once served. But such unchecked power never came without consequence. The more a pharaoh tried to become eternal, the more he revealed his greatest fear, that even gods can be forgotten. This is the story of pharaohs who ruled too long, built too high, and trusted too little. It is the story of kings who tried to become gods and found only darkness. Ramses the Great. Monuments to a man who would not be forgotten. If absolute power casts a long shadow, then Ramses II was the sun itself. Ruling for an astonishing 66 years, Ramses II, known to history as Ramses the Great, was not merely a pharaoh. He was a force of nature, a living legend, and perhaps the most enduring symbol of Egypt's might and ambition. His reign stretched so long, so wide, and so deep into Egyptian memory that many of his successors struggled to emerge from his looming presence. Even in death, his name echoed louder than most who lived. From the moment he took the throne in his 20s, Ramses embarked on a campaign not just of political or military conquest, but of immortalization. He would not merely be remembered, he would be impossible to forget. He built more temples, statues, and monuments than any pharaoh before or after him. His name was carved into stone across the length of Egypt, often so deeply that even later rulers who tried to erase it found the task impossible. In fact, he went so far as to reinscribe his name onto older monuments, claiming them as his own, a quiet but powerful rewriting of history. But it was not only in quantity that Ramses impressed, it was in scale. The temples of Abu Simbel, carved into the cliffs of Nubia, are perhaps the greatest examples of his divine ambition. For colossal statues of Ramses, each over 20 meters high, sit at the entrance like silent gods, their gazes fixed on eternity. Inside, vast halls of pillars, battle scenes, and inscriptions glorify his power, not just as king, but as a living deity. Twice a year, on carefully calculated dates, the rising sun penetrates the temple's inner sanctum, illuminating Ramses' statue, a deliberate alignment with the cosmos, as if to say, I rule not just the earth, but the heavens. He wasn't content to honor the gods. He made himself one. Temples such as Ramesseum in Thebes were constructed not for Ammonius, not for Ra, but for Ramses himself. It was a mortuary temple, yes, but also a propaganda machine. The walls showed his exploits in the Battle of Kadesh, the largest chariot battle in history, against the Hittite Empire. Though the battle ended in stalemate, Ramses portrayed it as a glorious solo victory, him, alone on the field, driving back thousands. The reality mattered less than the story, and the story was chiseled into walls for the gods, and for time, to remember. Statues of Ramses were everywhere. Over 100 surviving statues have been identified, and many more likely lost to time. They show him in every role, as king, as warrior, as father, as god. In some, he is embraced by Horus. In others, he is shown towering above prisoners, symbols of foreign lands crushed beneath his sandals. These were not just depictions, they were declarations. Ramses was Egypt. Ramses was divine. Ramses would live forever. And yet, beneath the glory, there lay the unmistakable echo of fear. To build so much, to inscribe one's name so furiously across the land, is not merely a sign of confidence. It is a defense against oblivion. Ramses, like all pharaohs, feared what came after death. Not judgment. He had prepared for that. But forgetting. To be erased, unnamed, unmourned. This was the true death. So he fought it the only way a god king could, by conquering memory itself. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings, KV7, was once a marvel, though damaged by floods and time. It still hints at its former magnificence. But even that was not enough. His mummy, later found in a cache of royal bodies hidden by priests, was preserved with extraordinary care. His face, even now, remains eerily lifelike. The high cheekbones, the aquiline nose, the closed lips of a man who ruled longer than most men live. But power brings isolation. Ramses fathered over 100 children, with numerous wives and concubines, but few could truly know him. Those who did rarely matched his brilliance or ambition. His successors struggled to step out of his towering legacy. Some simply adopted his name, becoming Ramses III, Ramses IV, Ramses V, as if they could absorb his power by imitation. But none equaled him. Egypt itself began to decline not long after his reign, a golden age fading into shadow. Even today, his legacy remains a paradox. He was glorious, ambitious, relentless, a ruler who transformed Egypt into an empire of stone. And yet, he was also deeply human, haunted by death, desperate to be eternal, surrounded by luxury but burdened by godhood. Ramses the Great did not just live in his time, he tried to escape it. And in doing so, he left behind more than monuments. He left a question that echoes across centuries. If you ruled like a god, would you still fear being forgotten? Into the afterlife, blood, loyalty, and the eternal retinue of Ramses the Great. As the sun set on the life of Ramses the Great, the most powerful man in Egypt, the man who claimed to be a god on earth, faced the same fate as all mortals, death. But Ramses did not go quietly. He had spent his life defying time, building monuments to the sky, carving his name into cliffs, and fathering a dynasty so vast that few could keep count. Yet in his final hours, he was no longer a builder or a warrior. He was a man standing at the edge of eternity. And like the pharaohs before him, he believed that crossing into the afterlife was not a journey to make alone. Ancient Egyptian belief taught that the afterlife was a mirror of the living world, complete with fields to cultivate, temples to visit, enemies to defeat, and divine courts to navigate. The pharaoh, now a divine spirit, would still need attendants, guards, musicians, and lovers. To be alone in the field of reeds was unthinkable. Thus, in earlier dynasties, kings were buried with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of sacrificed servants, ritually slain and placed around their tombs to serve them forever. By the time of Ramses II, this tradition had largely faded, at least publicly. Human sacrifice was no longer state policy. The rise of the Shabti figurines, magical servant statues, had offered a symbolic replacement. But Ramses, who styled himself in the image of the greatest kings of the Old Kingdom, may have revived the ancient practice in secret, or at least allowed it to continue in a modified, ritualized form. Historical records remain silent or ambiguous, and the tomb of Ramses II, KV7 in the Valley of the Kings, has suffered great damage from floods and looting. Yet tantalizing clues remain. In the early 20th century, excavations revealed burial niches near the entrance of his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, containing the remains of young women and male attendants, interred without individual tomb goods, in positions of ceremonial repose. Some scholars believe these may have been members of his inner household, concubines, musicians, and servants, who were ritually killed or poisoned upon his death to accompany him into the next world. Ancient texts and funerary inscriptions refer to the chosen who follow his majesty into the sacred horizon. In earlier dynasties, this phrase explicitly meant ritual death. Later, its meaning became blurred, spiritual devotion, metaphor, or a hidden tradition preserved by the elite. And Ramses, above all, would not have accepted an ordinary death. He had spent 6 decades asserting himself not merely as king, but as a god, builder of temples, slayer of enemies, father of a nation. His mortuary temple was a theater of divinity, filled with reliefs of gods bowing before him, of Ra extending the ankh of eternal life, of Horus standing watch. To pass into the afterlife without proper ceremony, without a retinue, without a court of the dead, would be a betrayal of everything he had built. Some legends, passed orally among later Egyptian priests and chronicled in fragmented texts, speak of a feast of farewell held in the days after Ramses' death. At this feast, certain favored servants were said to have drunk from the cup of eternal service, a euphemism perhaps for poison or narcotic sleep. Whether true or ritualistic, the myth captures the central belief. Death was not an ending, but a continuation of hierarchy. The pharaoh ruled in life. He must rule in death. Even his body was treated with more care than any before it. His mummification took over 70 days, the sacred maximum, using the finest resins, linen, and ritual formulae. His face, when rediscovered millennia later, bore a strange serenity, as if the embalmers had preserved not just his skin, but his presence. But the greatest evidence of his obsession with eternity may lie in what he left behind. Not just a tomb, but a kingdom carved for the soul. Temples that continued to perform offerings for centuries. Statues that kept his image alive. Inscriptions that commanded priests to chant his name every day, lest his spirit lose strength. And, perhaps, a circle of silent servants, whether flesh or figurine, buried in shadow, watching forever. It is likely that Ramses II, like the pharaohs before him, could not trust mere symbols. In a world where forgetting meant death, only the living could guarantee the memory of the dead. Whether by loyalty or sacrifice, those closest to him may have paid the ultimate price to join their master in the afterlife, where their service would never end. Modern historians may never find conclusive proof, but in Egypt, legend often speaks louder than stone. And in the stillness of the Theban cliffs, where the Ramesseum fades into sand and time, one can almost hear the rustle of linen, the whisper of prayers, and the quiet procession of souls still following their king. Murder in the palace. Pharaohs betrayed by their own. For all their divine titles and colossal monuments, the pharaohs of Egypt were not invincible. Behind the golden thrones, behind the polished walls of marble and limestone, daggers were always drawn in the shadows. Some pharaohs did not fall in battle or to old age. They fell by the hands of those closest to them, their wives, sons, advisors, and servants. In the hallowed palaces of ancient Egypt, where silence and loyalty were prized, even a whisper of ambition could end in blood. And often it did. One of the most infamous examples of royal betrayal was the fate of Ramses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. Though he ruled with power and grandeur, expanding temples and holding off foreign threats, his court was a nest of quiet vipers. Late in his reign, a deadly plot began to form, not in the streets, but in his own harem. One of his lesser wives, Queen Tai, sought to elevate her son, Prince Pintar, to the throne. But the rightful heir had already been chosen, born of Ramses's principal queen. Tai, unwilling to let her bloodline fade into obscurity, conspired with priests, scribes, royal officials, and members of the harem to assassinate the king and usurp the line of succession. This event, known as the Harem Conspiracy, was recorded in rare surviving papyri, some of the most dramatic and detailed legal documents from ancient Egypt. They describe secret meetings, coded messages, magic spells meant to paralyze guards, and even plans to incite revolt in the palace. The plot succeeded, at least in part. Ramses III was murdered, most likely by having his throat cut. CT scans of his mummy, performed in the 21st century, revealed a deep wound to the neck, so violent it would have caused immediate death. Strangely, embalmers placed a small amulet in the wound, perhaps hoping to magically restore what had been lost, to fool the gods into believing the king had died peacefully. But justice came swiftly. The conspirators were caught. A special court was assembled. Over 30 people were tried, including women of the harem, military officers, and palace scribes. The verdicts were brutal. Some were executed, others ordered to commit ritual suicide, and many were erased from the historical record, denied names, denied burial, denied eternity. Prince Pintar's fate is particularly haunting. His mummy, identified as the Screaming Mummy, was found in a rushed, unceremonious burial, his body contorted, his mouth wide open, as if frozen in agony. Scientists believe he took poison, dying in disgrace. The son who tried to seize a crown ended up cursed by history. But Ramses III was not the only pharaoh to fall by betrayal. Earlier in Egypt's long history, another ruler met a mysterious, violent end. King Teti, founder of the 6th dynasty. Teti had brought stability after a time of chaos, but his reign was cut short. Ancient texts simply state he was murdered by his guards. No further details remain. No names of conspirators. No trial. No retribution. Just a single, chilling line, suggesting that even the man who united the kingdom could not protect himself from a knife in the dark. Another curious case is that of Amenemhat I, the founder of the 12th dynasty. Though he reigned successfully, records written by his son, Senusret I, suggest a darker truth. In the text The Instruction of Amenemhat, the deceased pharaoh speaks from beyond the grave. Be on your guard against all who are subordinate to you. It was while I was resting, without a care, that the plot was made against me. My body was taken without my knowing. Historians believe this was a poetic confession of assassination. Amenemhat may have been slain by palace officials, or even by factions connected to his own family. His death prompted a rapid transfer of power to Senusret, possibly to prevent civil unrest. Even Tutankhamun, the boy king whose glittering tomb made him famous, may have died unnaturally. Though his cause of death remains debated, accident, illness, or infection, some skull damage and the hasty burial suggest foul play. With no heirs and a fragile dynasty, The young king's death opened the door to powerful advisors like Ai and Horemheb, who would eventually claim the throne for themselves. What unites all these deaths is not just violence, but intimacy. These were not coups by foreign armies or peasants. These were murders carried out by those who lived in the same palace, who shared meals, who bowed respectfully in the daylight, only to plot in the shadows of the night. The very structure of Pharaoh's absolute power made him dangerously vulnerable. With no opposition, no checks, and no external pressure, all rivalries turned inward. And in the harem, where beauty and politics intertwined, ambition sharpened behind veils of silk. Queens could be allies or assassins. A concubine's son could become Pharaoh, if only the right poison found the king's cup. In the end, for all their divinity, pharaohs bled like any man. And no amount of gold, no number of guards or priests or prayers, could save them from the one threat they never expected: family. Eternal legacy and lessons for the present. More than 3,000 years have passed since the last true pharaoh walked the sands of Egypt. The temples have crumbled, the tombs have been breached, the great dynasties reduced to ruins beneath layers of time and silence. And yet, the pharaohs still live on, not in flesh, but in stone, not in power, but in memory, not in palaces, but in the hearts of those who still wonder. The legacy of ancient Egypt is not just about mummies, pyramids, or golden masks. It is the story of human ambition taken to its highest form, and of how a civilization sought to answer the greatest question of all: how do we live forever? In their pursuit of immortality, the pharaohs built more than monuments. They built myths. They created a cultural gravity so powerful that thousands of years later, we still feel its pull. We still speak their names: Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Ramses. We still marvel at their achievements, puzzle over their mysteries, and draw meaning from their downfall. But within the splendor lies a warning. The pharaohs, for all their greatness, also remind us of the fragility of power, the cost of ego, and the danger of forgetting our own humanity. They ruled as gods, but died as men. Their desire to control life, death, even memory itself, brought both awe and ruin. So as we walk beneath the shadow of their monuments, we are not just tourists in an ancient land. We are witnesses to a lesson written not in ink, but in granite. That no throne is eternal. That legacy is earned not by force, but by meaning. And that what we build, say, and believe today will echo long after we are gone. This is the true gift of the pharaohs, a mirror held up to time, reflecting not just their world, but ours. A civilization's gift, the eternal treasures of art, architecture, medicine, and faith. The pharaohs are long gone, but what they left behind continues to shape the world. Their monuments may be weathered by sand and time, but their legacy remains etched into the very fabric of human civilization. The ancient Egyptians gave us more than tombs. They gave us a blueprint for greatness, a map of the human spirit drawn in stone, color, science, and sacred belief. Art, the language of the divine. Egyptian art was never just decoration. It was sacred storytelling, crafted with precision and purpose. Every figure, every color, every gesture carried meaning. Pharaohs were always larger than their subjects. Gods were portrayed in idealized forms: falcon heads, sun discs, and lotus flowers, not for beauty, but for symbolism. Tombs and temples were painted with vivid murals that captured not just daily life, but the journey of the soul. In scenes of banquets, hunting, music, and ritual, we glimpse a civilization deeply connected to both the physical and spiritual worlds. They painted eternity with steady hands. Their style was consistent across millennia, not out of stagnation, but because it reflected a fixed cosmic order. To disrupt, it would mean disrupting Maya, the divine balance. In this way, art in ancient Egypt was not about expression. It was about alignment with the eternal. And yet, within that discipline bloomed immense creativity. Jewelry that sparkled with lapis and turquoise, sculptures of quiet majesty, and funerary masks like that of Tutankhamun, faces of the dead immortalized in gold, so that the soul would never be lost. Architecture, building for eternity. The sheer scale and sophistication of Egypt's monuments continue to baffle architects and engineers today. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built with over 2 million stone blocks, aligned perfectly to the cardinal directions, remains one of the greatest engineering feats in history. Temples such as Karnak, Luxor, and Abu Simbel weren't just places of worship. They were cosmic diagrams, structured to reflect the journey of the sun, the harmony of the universe, and the pharaoh's divine role in maintaining it. Columns carved with papyrus and lotus motifs rose like frozen forests. Obelisks pointed toward the sky, inscribed with prayers meant to last forever. Unlike modern architecture, designed for function or comfort, Egyptian structures were built for spiritual resonance. Every stone had purpose. Every wall told a story. They were not made to be inhabited, but to be inhabited by gods. And because they built for eternity, not for empires, not for kings, but for cosmic truth, many of their works still stand. Medicine, the science of life and death. Ancient Egypt was not only a land of gods and kings, it was a cradle of early scientific thought, especially in the realm of medicine. Egyptian doctors practiced surgery, diagnosed disease, treated wounds, and understood the value of cleanliness long before such concepts reached the wider ancient world. Papyrus scrolls like the Ebers Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus revealed detailed knowledge of anatomy, herbal medicine, dentistry, and trauma care. They described everything from broken bones and tumors to contraception and depression. Egyptian physicians used honey as an antiseptic, willow bark for pain relief, containing the precursor to aspirin, and castor oil as a laxative. They were also among the first to distinguish between physical illness and spiritual affliction. Illnesses were treated both with herbal remedies and incantations, because health, like everything else in Egypt, was understood as a balance between the body, the soul, and the divine forces of the universe. Even mummification, though rooted in religion, demonstrated profound anatomical understanding. Embalmers knew how to remove the brain through the nose, preserve organs, and prevent decay through salt and oils. They were practicing preservation at a level no one else on earth could match. Religion, the heartbeat of the Nile. If art gave Egypt its beauty, and architecture its grandeur, and medicine its practicality, then religion was its soul. The ancient Egyptians lived not in fear of the gods, but in cooperation with them. Their pantheon, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Thoth, Anubis, and hundreds more, was not distant, but present. In the wind, in the river, in the stars. The gods were everywhere, watching, guiding, judging. Pharaohs were not just kings. They were living gods, embodiments of Horus, intermediaries between the heavens and the earth. The rituals they performed weren't personal. They were cosmic necessities, keeping the wheel of life in motion. And yet, their religion was not static. It evolved. Temples became more elaborate. Myths deepened. The Book of the Dead, with its intricate spells and instructions, became a guidebook to the afterlife, not just for pharaohs, but for common people too. Religion was democratized, and eternity became possible not just for kings, but for any soul who lived with honor. Their belief in life after death gave birth to a culture obsessed not with dying, but with surviving death. Every act, of work, of love, of law, was weighed by Ma'at, the feather of truth. And when death came, it was not the end, but a gate to judgment and potential rebirth. The echo that still speaks. These legacies, of beauty, of order, of knowledge, of faith, did not die with Egypt's last pharaoh. They spread, evolved, and shaped the cultures that followed. Greek philosophers studied Egyptian medicine and cosmology. Roman emperors admired and imitated their temples. Modern engineers still marvel at the precision of their pyramids. Artists and architects draw inspiration from their timeless designs. Spiritual seekers return to their texts for wisdom on death, balance, and purpose. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the pharaohs is this: the idea that human effort can defy time. That what we build, be it a monument, a philosophy, a belief, can echo across centuries if it is rooted in meaning, truth, and vision. The pharaohs may be dust, but their dreams still live in stone, scroll, and soul. A warning in stone, power, injustice, and the obsession with immortality. The legacy of the pharaohs is dazzling. Their monuments are sublime, their achievements awe-inspiring. But walk long enough through the ruins, listen closely enough to the echo of their stories, and another voice begins to emerge, a voice not of glory, but of warning. For all the beauty they built, the pharaohs also left behind a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, systemic injustice, and the human desire to conquer death at any cost. At the heart of Egypt's splendor stood the pharaoh, god-king, master of all lands, commander of the Nile and the heavens above. He was divine in title and absolute in authority. His words became law. His image was worshipped. His ego could be etched across a continent. Yet this divinity came with a dark price. No one dared to challenge him. And where power goes unchallenged, corruption follows. The pharaohs, especially in their later dynasties, built ever larger monuments, not for the gods, but for themselves. Some, like Ramses II, turned temples into personal altars. Others demanded that their statues be taller than those of any deity. Some changed the religious calendar to suit their own birthdays. Even Akhenaten, in his revolution toward monotheism, replaced centuries of polytheistic worship, not with humility, but with a cult of himself and the sun. In the shadow of such megalomania, ordinary Egyptians toiled in silence. The laborers who hauled limestone blocks for decades received no tombs, no names in history. Many died during construction, buried beneath the very walls they built. Though the modern myth of slave-built pyramids has been largely debunked, many workers were skilled laborers. The reality remains. The lives of thousands were sacrificed to satisfy one man's dream of eternity. This imbalance between ruler and ruled, between glory and sacrifice, is one of the most striking contradictions in Egyptian history. While pharaohs bathed in oils, feasted beneath gold leaf ceilings, and were buried with treasures, much of the population lived by the flood cycles of the Nile, dependent on the whims of nature and royal decree. Justice, in theory, was central to Egyptian thought. The principle of Ma'at demanded balance and fairness. But under the weight of autocracy, justice often became a ritual, not a reality. Trials favored the elite. Punishments were harsh for commoners. And within the palace, betrayal festered. Queens poisoning rivals, sons plotting patricide, advisors pulling strings behind silken curtains. Even in death, injustice echoed. Early pharaohs had their servants and concubines sacrificed to serve them in the afterlife, a brutal expression of power extended beyond the grave. Though later replaced with symbolic figurines, the belief remained. Others must continue to serve, even in eternity. And then there was the obsession with immortality, the relentless drive to be remembered, to conquer time itself. It was this obsession that led to the carving of colossal statues, the hoarding of gold, the building of labyrinthine tombs, and the recording of every royal deed in stone. Some pharaohs erased their predecessors from records, fearing that even memory shared was memory stolen. Others built second tombs, hidden deep in cliffs, terrified that their bodies might be disturbed, and with them, their souls. This fear of death, this refusal to accept mortality, drove many of Egypt's greatest architectural and artistic feats. But it also created a culture fixated not on how to live well, but on how to avoid being forgotten. It shaped a society where legacy outweighed compassion, where being remembered was more important than being just. And yet, even the pharaohs could not escape the one truth they feared most. Their tombs were robbed. Their names were chiseled away. Their bodies were unwrapped, burned, sold. The temples they built were buried by sand, conquered by desert, repurposed by future empires. For all their efforts, eternity eluded them. But from this failure emerges perhaps the most valuable lesson. Immortality cannot be bought with stone. It is not preserved in gold. It is not secured through fear or control. True legacy lives not in what we build for ourselves, but in what we build for others. In ideas, values, kindness, in justice, in balance. The pharaohs gave the world brilliance and beauty. But they also gave us a mirror, a chance to look into the eyes of absolute power and ask, what does it mean to be remembered? What is the cost of being worshipped? What do we lose when we fear death more than we love life? their monuments still stand. Their names are still spoken, but the silence between those stones may speak even louder. Even gods must die, the final truth of the pharaohs. They called themselves gods. Their people bowed to them. Their words shaped laws. Their images were carved into mountains. Their tombs stretched across desert horizons. They were the sons of Ra, the voice of Ma'at, the lords of the two lands. They ruled not just in life, but in death, commanding legions of priests to preserve their names for all eternity. And yet, they all died. No matter how divine, no matter how powerful, every pharaoh eventually fell before the same silent truth that claims us all: death. Some died in battle. Some were poisoned by their wives. Some died in their sleep, wrapped in linen and illusion. Others were forgotten within a generation, replaced, renamed, erased from stone. The illusion of immortality, so carefully built with gold and granite, eventually cracked beneath the weight of time. Sand buried their cities. Thieves plundered their tombs. Temples fell. Statues crumbled. Their stories faded into whispers. Even their bodies, once wrapped in sacred oils and incantations, were disturbed, moved, and in many cases stripped of their dignity. The golden mask of Tutankhamun survived, but his dynasty did not. Ramses the Great was found centuries later, not in his grand tomb, but hidden in a secret cache, placed there by desperate priests trying to protect what little remained of divine memory. And yet, this ending is not a defeat. It is, instead, a revelation. The pharaohs, for all their flaws, for all their tyranny, splendor, cruelty, and genius, were deeply, painfully human. Their fear of death was not weakness, it was recognition. Their quest for eternal life was not arrogance, it was longing. They built pyramids not to escape death, but to face it with purpose. They filled their tombs not to hoard wealth, but to bring meaning to departure. They ruled as gods, yes, but they died as men. And in doing so, they left behind something even greater than temples or treasures. They left behind a truth, that no one escapes the end. But in that ending, there is beauty. And in that beauty, there is memory. And in memory, there is legacy. The pharaohs may not have become immortal in body, but they endure in story, in the stones that whisper their names, in the myths that still inspire awe, in the questions they left behind. What is power? What does it mean to be remembered? Is eternity something we earn, or something we accept? Their journey reminds us that the measure of a life is not found in how high one builds, how loudly one commands, or how long one reigns. It is found in how deeply one shapes the world, and how gently one is remembered. Even gods must die, but legends, if born of truth, can live forever. Final reflections, beyond the sands, a legacy eternal. The story of the pharaohs is not merely a chronicle of kings, temples, and tombs. It is a mirror, a reflection of humanity at its most ambitious, most spiritual, and most flawed. Within their golden masks and stone sarcophagi, we find more than royal bones. We find the same questions we still ask today. What is power? What is life for? How do we matter after we're gone? They ruled as living gods, built monuments that pierced the sky, and filled the desert with visions of eternity. They pushed the limits of architecture, art, medicine, and faith. And yet, they feared the same fate we all do, to be forgotten. Their brilliance gave us beauty. Their tyranny gave us warning, and their death gave us perspective. In each towering obelisk, we see the reach of human will. In each shattered statue, the truth that nothing lasts forever. And in each carefully painted tomb wall, the tender hope that something, anything, might endure. The pharaohs remind us that immortality isn't found in gold or granite. It is found in meaning, in memory, in the lives we touch and the truths we leave behind. Today, we no longer build pyramids. We no longer bury our kings with chariots and prayers, but we still long to be remembered. We still reach for something eternal in a fleeting world. So let us learn from the pharaohs, not only from their greatness, but from their failings. Let us seek wisdom, not just power. Let us build for others, not only for ourselves. And let us remember that even the greatest empires return to dust, but the ideas they plant can bloom again across centuries. The Nile still flows, the stars still rise, and somewhere, beneath the silence of the sand, the pharaohs sleep, not as gods, but as men who dared to defy time. Their story is finished, but their echo still speaks.